Hello, welcome to Let the Stone Speak. This is a podcast where we bring to you the latest in biblical archaeology from here in Jerusalem. This podcast is also in print form. This comes out with a magazine entitled Let the Stone Speak. It comes out 6 times per year. It's available for you to you for free wherever you are in the world. If you want to request this magazine, which will form much of the content of this podcast, you can do so by writing emails to letters@armstrongmazar.com. This podcast and also the magazine are part of the publications and the media of the Armstrong Mazar Institute of Biblical Archaeology. This is a brand new Biblical Archaeology Institute started here in Jerusalem. Of course, our history involved in excavation and publication and research and sponsorship of excavations goes back for over 50 years here in Jerusalem. And we have finally decided to start this new institute so that we can really bring the discoveries of biblical Jerusalem all the way to the general public. We're going to take it out of the realm with this podcast and also the magazine, out of the realm of academia and into the realm of a popular audience without, as our aim is, to not sacrifice any type of scientific quality or accuracy in the process. For today's podcast, we're going to be talking with archaeologist Christopher Eames about a new article he wrote for the first edition of Let the Stone Speak. So please stay with us and enjoy the show. So Chris, thanks for coming on the show once again.
Not a problem. Glad to be here.
So we're going to be talking about your article that is in the first edition of Let the Stone Speak, a really interesting way of looking at the kingdoms of David and Solomon, particularly Solomon. And your article is entitled Rethinking the Search for King Solomon, and it's quipped this way: are we using the right metrics to judge the united monarchy? So first of all, perhaps you can give us a little bit of background as to the debate in archaeological circles about this period of David and Solomon, and then what you're kind of introducing here is another way of relating to that time period based on the archaeological evidence.
Sure thing. Well, for those who have followed biblical archaeology for any length of time, you'll know that the debate surrounding the significance of David and Solomon's kingdom is like one of the great debates, one of the greatest debates. Just how significant were they? Was it, as the Bible says, this splendid kingdom full of riches, gold, silver, etc., or was it more of a minor kingdom that's been kind of trumped up by later biblical writers who are seeking to kind of elevate David and Solomon more than they were? Now, as a side, one of the things that I think is really remarkable about this debate is where we are in this debate right now, because it wasn't that long ago the debate was whether or not King David and Solomon existed at all. Now, that was pretty much put to rest in 1993 with the discovery of the Tel Dan stela, primarily attesting to royal house of David. So now it's kind of moved into, well, how significant was 10th century BCE Israel, this time period, this real kind of century block time period in which King David and King Solomon existed? Was it as the Bible says, or was it more as is popularly led by Professor Finkelstein, other types like that? Was it more of a minor tribal chieftain situation in the highlands, maybe? I think they've speculated the number could have been 5,000 people in the whole of southern Judah, occupying that area in kind of scattered clusters. Was it more of a decentralized situation like that? So that's the big debate as it stands. And going into this first issue of Let the Stone Speak, I mean, we spend a lot of time on King David and Solomon in the past. We've written quite a lot of articles on them. They're quite a central part, obviously, of the Bible story. So we thought it would be great to have something connected to that in the very first issue. But really, the impetus for this article for me came in a completely different way, came quite by chance, you could say. I was listening to a lecture recently, and the person giving the lecture, he was quoting from a book that he was reading by Rodney Stark called "How the West Won," and it's a fantastic book, a book that I hadn't to that point read. But what this book establishes is a lot of the kind of false narratives that have built up about our ideas of the past and how we have got to today, quite a rich Western civilization. And where did that come from? All of this kind of individuality, all of this individual personal wealth. And some of the passages that were brought up in that book were really interesting and got me thinking that wow, this is actually what we're seeing.
Right.
Number one, in the Bible, what the Bible says of this time period of David and Solomon, and this is what archaeology is showing as well. And
perhaps you could just talk about, I guess, what you say in the very beginning that maybe we need to look at different metrics to judge the accuracy of the biblical account for David and Solomon, and the way that people have gone about that almost exclusively would be the presence of big structures from the 10th century throughout Israel and in Jerusalem. And that is kind of the only metric that people use to determine whether the Bible is accurate in this case.
Right. Monumentalism is another good word for it. Really this kind of obsession with large, massive structures, okay? We look at ancient Egypt and we think that must have been an incredible, wealthy, powerful empire to build these big pyramids, to build these big structures. You go across to Mesopotamian areas, ziggurats, Babylon, massive structures. I think Nebuchadnezzar's ziggurat, floor plan of 300 by 300 feet, nearly 100 by 100 meters. You go across to China, you've got the massive Forbidden City, Great Wall of China. So these are kind of this is kind of the modern bias we have in a way for judging the power and might of ancient empires. Now,
I wonder if I could just jump in here. There's something you bring out towards the end of your piece. You compare it to some place in Eastern Europe compared to the United States as it exists today in terms of the power that each of them have and how we could judge that and what happens if we judge that solely on monumental structures.
Right, yeah, the example I bring out is with Romania. So Romania has, fascinatingly, I kind of discovered this recently as well, they have the heaviest administration building anywhere in the world. It's called the Palace of the President, or something to that effect. The name has changed since it has left the communist leadership. But it is the heaviest, most expensive, second most expensive administration building anywhere in the world. If you look up pictures of it, it looks incredible. It was commissioned by the last communist dictator of Romania, Ceausescu. And if you look at pictures of it, it looks crazy. It looks incredible. It looks massive, like proper Ramses style stuff.
Right.
And even the pictures don't do it justice because a good portion of it is actually underground in several layers. The building is so big and heavy it actually sinks a centimeter every year into the ground. So when you think about mighty powers, I kind of set up the point in the article this way. What would archaeologists looking back to our time in the future think if they saw the ruins of something like this? Would they think, wow, Romania must have been one of the great empires of our day?
Right.
But actually, when you look at it today, Romania has the highest poverty rate in all of Europe. Highest poverty rate. And I go through some of the other stats in the article, but these stats actually represent an improvement on what Romania was in the 1990s under communist rule at the time that this building was finished. So really the point is made there in the article that, wait a second, we can, especially in our day and age, we can't really judge the wealth, the power, the richness of a kingdom just based on big structures or based on the fact that it took a despot and a personality cult surrounding him in order to create these structures. And that's really what Rodney Stark brings out in the first chapter of his book, really asking or presenting the case that actually the empires of old, of Egypt, of Babylon, were very poor empires. Okay, we have some big monuments, but those monuments, for all intents and purposes, are worthless. They had no worth to the population. They were built on the backs of slaves in most cases. The vast majority of the population lived, as one of the people he quoted stated, they lived in a state of utter destitution, little better than their cattle and oxen.
Right.
So is that the wealth that we should be seeking from King David and Solomon's kingdom? Monumentalism?
So if that isn't the case, and we have to look for more, maybe you can get into some of those other metrics. And you probably we do need to temper this debate, and even you do so inside your article, just with the fact that we do see monumental structures from Solomon's time as well. And I think more evidence is going to be surfacing and be published about that, especially in Jerusalem over the next few months. And so we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater and say monumentalism is all wrong. We shouldn't expect to find any type of big structures associated with David and Solomon, because as archaeologists, that is kind of one of the things that we have to try and reconstruct the past, is the size of structures. Perhaps you can talk about some of those other metrics that we can judge ancient Israel in particular in relation to what the Bible describes that society as.
Sure. Well, what the primary example I use for this article is Timna and the excavations that have been going on there in Timna, primarily directed by Professor Erez Ben Yosef. Really interesting discoveries that he's been making in Timna. And there's a lot of additional points that could be made from other sites, but this article can only be so long. So.
Well, maybe you can talk about a couple of these other points that you bring up, and I think we have these on the infographic too, inside the article. Maybe deal with them quickly, and then we'll get to Timna.
So when we think about what makes a wealthy society, okay, in our day and age, that would be education. That would be a wealthy populace.
Not necessarily just the elite.
Not just the elite. It would be a well-running economy, market-driven economy, well-clothed populace, well-sheltered populace, well-laid-out sort of cities, that type thing, well-constructed utensils, pottery, that type of thing. And that's really what we start to see from the 10th century forward. Like if you compare that time period to the prior, shall we say, Judges era, that's the Iron One period, you really start to see a transformation in, for example, pottery and the way pottery is made and developed and specialized. And you really see an explosion in growth in these various avenues in the 10th century BC. So this is really what I get into in this article. What could have caused this? What kind of government could have caused this? Now, it goes without saying that in looking at the wealth of the populace, we can't really be looking for gold and silver and jewelry spread all over the place. Okay, Israel has been plundered numerous times over, just about unlike any other country on earth. Dug to its foundations in various periods, looking for gold.
Right. That's very annoying when people kind of dispute with the Bible and one of their big points is there's been no glorious golden this or golden that's been found from the 10th century. Like as you say, I mean, historical record, Bible or outside, talk about how every foreign invading country isn't going to destroy the building and leave the precious jewels or gold. They're going to take that with them. And so, yeah, that's an absence of evidence. There's what people are going to base that argument on.
Right. So there are other avenues that we can look at, though. Other things that wouldn't necessarily be plundered, but that still could speak to the richness of that society. So as a case in point, I look at Timna, but as you say, there are other things scattered throughout Israel. Pottery, evidence from pottery, even the composition of pottery, you can start to see a transformation and a more refined way of producing vessels, pottery vessels. You can see the layout of cities, specifically in the 10th century BCE. You see the six-chambered gates, the famous gates, most famously discovered in Hatzor, Megiddo, Gezer, very similar gate in Jerusalem. These are all four cities described as being built by Solomon in, 1 Kings 9, verse 15, something to that effect. And we see an exact layout of gates. Really strong, powerfully built gates, impressive gates, but not necessarily a gate that elevates a single city, such as Hatzor, Gezer, or Megiddo. Okay, there's some evidence coming out that Jerusalem's gate was more impressive, as you'd expect from a capital city. But you really see evidence of urban planning, not trying to make one city safer than another necessarily, but really a blueprint used across the kingdom.
Right, and we should mention that a lot of people some people would have tried to push the dating of these things further into the 9th century, outside the 10th century. I think there'll be, again, more evidence that comes out on that, and so don't put all your eggs in one basket for that. If you've read that this is from Ahab or Omri or something like that, there's certainly a lot more evidence that can come out involving carbon samples, perhaps, that might be taken here soon. So definitely something worth keeping our eyes on there. So we have, I guess, you have the pottery, you have literacy, I think, is another point, and then you mentioned the fact that you have these gates indicating a centralized government structure that does push out its engineers to construct a similar style gate. Again, these gates are amazing. The width between the gates is within like half a centimeter or something like that with every single one, which is phenomenal to think that they had that level of precision back then, indicating a central planner. Maybe you can just jump to Timna, and we can start talking about that.
Sure. And you do mention literacy, and that's brought up in this article, evidence of literacy in the 10th century. So with Timna is a really interesting case because it is a mining community just north of the Gulf of Aqaba. Excavations have been ongoing there for the past century. In the early 20th century, it was kind of sensationalized as, this is the place of King Solomon's mines, because Timna is specifically a massive copper mining industry, and copper is a primary element that goes into bronze, a primary component that goes into bronze, which the Bible informs was produced in mass quantity for Solomon and for Solomon's temple. So the early excavators, Nelson Glueck, or however you pronounce his name, they really pointed to this as the location of the King Solomon's mines, dating to the 10th century. Now, in later decades, there was some pushback to that, okay? That you're getting into a time of really doubting the veracity of the biblical account of Solomon and David. Did these guys even really exist? And what they found was some evidence from the 12th century BCE, okay, a couple centuries later, of Egyptian presence in the area. So this was a somewhat Egyptian-controlled area. There was a large shrine there, more, shall we say, monumental constructions in that respect. And so these scientists pointed to the primary spike in copper production as coming from that time period. Now, they knew that there was a massive spike in copper production sometime within these centuries. Initially, it was put in the 10th century BCE time period, belonging to David and Solomon. But now this tried to revise it to, it must have been Egyptian. This must have been 12th century that we see this spike in copper production. Well, thanks to the efforts of Professor Ben Yosef and the people that he has worked with, that has been able to be confirmed and refined to a dating of the 10th century BCE, just the highest spike in copper production that these mines have ever seen. And these mines have been in use for millennia. They've been proven to be in use. They have massive slag heaps, and you can really date your way quite evenly through the layers.
And so that was from radiocarbon dating that he was able to...
Right, primarily it was from radiocarbon dating that they were able to prove that this chief amount of production was from the 10th century BCE. And actually, the 12th century Egyptian-controlled period, there was a drop-off in copper production. Something was going on there that caused a drop-off. And then you have a massive spike during the 10th century, and then in the 9th century, you have a drop-off again, and conveniently enough, it's at the end of the 10th and into the 9th century that you have Egypt moving into that territory once again. And so that poses the question, what kind of regional rulership was going on that allowed for such a spike? And not only a spike in the 10th century BCE, but there was evidence of refining of techniques in copper production. And I think you've written about this in the past, getting more refined in their techniques in mining this copper, and different technological advancements during this period. And this is something that Rodney Stark wrote about, even to do with another example of a mining community in China.
I think we'll save that one for the people that read your article. Sure. Lest we be here for 3 hours.
Yeah.
But I think it's really interesting because, Erez Ben Yosef comes along then and says, whoops, this is dating to the 10th century, this increase in technology, and the ability to refine the copper to a better extent. And, he dares to look at the historical record of the source that talks about the 10th century, the Bible. And he's like, well, it kind of looks like exactly what we'd expect to find there in Timna.
Right. And exactly that's what Second Chronicles 18 talks about. It talks about David conquering this area, the Edomites that lived in this area supporting David or providing goods for David, and it talks about David setting up garrisons in the area. And so David, this period is about 1000 BCE, and that's exactly what they've found. They've found remains of garrisons, shall we say, or fortifications that were set up exactly at this time period. So it just makes sense to put the two and two together like that.
So that's the dating of it, 10th century. What else did they find that follows on with your paper?
Sure. Amongst these slag heaps, these are of course slag refuse heaps, they found a plethora of other discoveries, not just copper slag, but they also found scraps of clothing. Now, this got really interesting because the clothing during this 10th century period that they found was really beautiful weaves, beautiful dyes of clothing, orange, black, blues, and reds. The Bible talks about the blues and the reds, the colors that were commissioned by King Solomon. Really beautiful colors that beg the question, what are they doing in a mining community?
Right.
Like your Egyptian slaves, Egyptian people that would be sent to do this type thing, at best they would be wearing a single color plain wraparound, if not naked. They often had their slaves work naked. And here you've got this mining community where you've got remains of clothing, of beautiful, more like Joseph's coat of many colors type clothing. Right. And then even more sensationally, last year, either last year or the year before, they discovered purple, a royal purple fabric, purple dyed fabric, the argamon color that's mentioned in the Bible. Now, this is the richest of the rich type fabric. This is the earliest example that's ever been found by 1,000 years. It's mentioned in the Bible in the context of the temple, even and in the Roman times, the wealth of this argamon dye, it was so precious it was worth 10 to 20 times its weight in gold. I think on our last podcast I gave you the wrong stat. I said about 3 times. It's actually more like 10 to 20 times in certain settings, certain periods. So this was wealthy fabric. And it begs the question, what is it doing in the middle of a desert, in the middle of a mining community during the 10th century BCE? What were these people wearing at this time? How rich must they have been? And these remains go beyond clothing. They found remains of food, pomegranates, olives, various foods that could not have been grown in that area. They must have been grown around the Mediterranean somewhere. Right. So these are imported, rich, wealthy foods, wheat even, was among the list. Almonds, various foods that must have been imported. And what I found was really interesting was that even the fish was imported. Okay, Timna is not that far from the Gulf of Aqaba, just to the south. But these fish remains weren't from they were able to show that they weren't from the Gulf of Aqaba. They were from the Mediterranean Sea.
Right.
Even donkey manure that was found. So the donkeys were the primary pack animals during the 10th century BCE. They were able to examine the manure. They were able to determine that the feed that the donkeys ate was from the Jerusalem area. So what does this all point to? This is exactly fitting with the biblical picture in terms of the use of copper or bronze. But not only that, in terms of just the immense wealth that must have gone on to be able to have such a clothed community, number one, to have such a fed community, even the pack animals.
So you've got all of these different elements that are material remains from the time of the 10th century, imported from the Mediterranean region, or at least further to the north. It looks to match the biblical description of what Solomon was doing there, getting his... he would at least be involved down there because that's the main copper mining facility, as you say. So what are those physical details? What are those details, all of what you've described in Timna say about the population itself? Let's get back to this thought about the different metrics in which to judge Solomon's kingdom. What do those discoveries say about the kingdom of Judah from the 10th century, or Israel from the 10th century?
Well, it really points to the wealth and prosperity of the individual people. And this is something repeatedly emphasized in the Bible, that kings, it's talked about in the Torah, that kings should be careful not to have their heart lifted up above their brethren by accruing to themselves gold or riches. Mm-hmm. So it really shows that the population, not just the monarch, was richly endowed in this way. And the fact that such a community could be allowed to exist, such wealth could be allowed to be had, and such economic development in such a remote area really shows a system probably more like America today, mm-hmm. more of a capitalist kind of system, a system that doesn't really vaunt the president as some kind of great demigod-like figure, but it allows communities and individuals to develop and run their own operations. And it's under this kind of environment, not command economies, mm-hmm. which is what we see in communist-type societies, what we see in ancient empires like Egypt, what's known as a command economy, coercion for labor and for produce. Really, you see things drop off, and under those types of economies, you see production drop off. You see people become more kind of secluded and sheltered and less likely to show their wealth. Mm-hmm. And that's what we see in the 12th century BCE at Timna. That's what we see more in the 9th century at Timna, under these periods of Egyptian rule, but yet somehow that's all cast to the side in the 10th century, and you start to see this evidence of a more individualistic, more rich and wealthy type society here at Timna. And again, Timna is just one case in point. There's another mine at Fainan, the Fainan mine, where more evidence is coming that's pointing to the same thing from the 10th century, and like we talked about from other areas of Israel. More and more evidence like this, but yet a lack of monumentalism. So this is something that that Professor Ben Yosef has been writing about a lot recently, trying to square this. Okay, it's not like these other kingdoms, mm-hmm. but we can see there's some kind of wealthy hierarchy here, some kind of wealthy government and population and economy happening here, a really healthy kind of environment compared to under these other empires. So what could be responsible for that? What could be causing that? And so that's really prompted him and several articles that he's recently come out with to really relook at the way we understand monumentalism and the focus we tend to put too much on massive stone structures.
If we're going to be judging from this period in particular as well.
Right, especially these stone structures. And we do have evidence of significant stone structures, but we don't have the same kind of over-the-top, ostentatious type worship of leaders like in these more despotic states in Egypt, in Mesopotamia, in ancient China, that type of thing.
Well, I think people can go ahead and I think this article should be online maybe in a week or so, and so they can read through it themselves and make up their own mind based on the evidence you present and the most plausible reconstruction of what happened there in Timna based on what they found, and then also putting it alongside the biblical text as well. I think that's the type of thing that we're going to be doing a lot of at Let the Stone Speak, and this is something that is a kind of a maligned modus operandi in the archaeological field in many ways today. I even was reading through an article and a journal piece just today of those from colleagues of Ben Yosef's that are kind of dismissing some of his what he's written about what happened in Timna, and so he's even facing the fire in many ways for going out and basically saying, we do have this amazing construction, amazing evidence of sophisticated society at this far-off region. It dates to King Solomon's time. That's the historical source. And so what happened here? What's the most logical reconstruction of that history? And without the Bible, you are going to guess. And I'm not going to get into this other journal piece. Perhaps there'll be time for that. But a lot of people would just dismiss his evidence from the 10th century and putting it with the historical source, basically saying it was continued Egyptian probably a bit of a continued Egyptian domination without the evidence of that, which is just it reminds me a lot of what Professor Garfinkel faced after his discovery of Kibbutz Caiaphas. He wasn't looking for it, dead to the 10th century. It's Judean, and then like the barrage of journal articles come out saying, no, you're wrong, it can't be Judean. I think Ben Yosef is kind of putting himself in some ways in the line of fire. But good for him sticking to his guns in this. And again, if you want let's say a piece that dabbles in Timna and then looks at more of the 10th century's evidence for what the Bible describes as society under the reigns of Solomon, your article is a wonderful place to go. So we'll leave a link for that in the show notes, and hopefully if you click on that in the next day or two, it should be live on our new website. So thanks very much, Chris, for sharing that with us.
Thank you very much, Brent.